Hello, Fiskamar, Kimir Hashev, how are you doing? Welcome to our third webinar and final webinar with the Ideas Fund. My name is Lewis. I am the Development Coordinator for the Highlands and Islands, and I also run the Science Ceilidh, which is also partnering to support this series of sessions. Today, we are building on the previous two webinars and focusing further on what good partnerships might look like to you, especially connecting with researchers and communities, and focusing on some practical tips for you to consider as your project and your partnership develops. Just to run through really quickly what we're going to cover today. Again, we've got another brief update from the British Science Association and the Ideas Fund team about the progress about the fund, and particularly around the details about the writing and thinking about the application itself and the budget. We have two speakers from Manchester who are going to be sharing their learning from a project using arts to support dialogue and exchange between researchers, midwives, and the Jewish community. And just to let you know in advance, this project involves the experiences of stillbirth, and we want to flag that and acknowledge that this is a sensitive topic. We'll bring back all the development coordinators from the rest of the different localities to update about what's going on in their areas. We'll be sharing their tips about building partnerships to consider for your application project, along with the next steps that can be made in each area. And again, there will be time at the very end for question and answers. So if you do have any questions for our speakers about the process, the development coordinators, please do write these specifically in the question and answer box. Last time we did try and answer these as we went along to try and give as much space for discussion. So we'll aim to do that again. And again, if there's lots of questions, we'll prioritize the ones for our speakers for now and make sure there's a chance to pick up these questions afterwards and email out the Q&A afterwards. Finally, don't forget we'll follow on with this with a local workshop taking place in each locality, which you can already register for on the website, and we'll share the dates at the very end of the session in case you haven't got that. And we'll also be talking about the next steps as it'll look a little bit different in the different areas. I will now hand over to Chris to update briefly about the fund.
Thank you very much, Lewis, and hello again, everyone. Thank you all for joining our final webinar today. We hope you found them useful so far, and in the same way as we did last time out, I just wanted to kick off by giving a few bits of information about the fund in response to some of the queries that we've had. I know that people have joined the process at different stages, and there are still people maybe joining today who are just hearing about the fund for the first time and getting in contact, which is brilliant. So if you do have queries that I don't cover here, please do put them in the Q&A box or listen back to some of our previous webinars, which are on the Ideas Fund website. So the areas I'm going to run through today, quite brief really, but mostly around the guidance or pointers around the application form itself, including when it will be available, grant amounts, and some other more specific queries that you might be thinking about. So firstly, in terms of the application form, just to clarify, we expect that this will be available on our website during the week of the 5th of April. So remember, the deadline for applications is the 14th of May at midday. So that gives around 5 to 5.5 weeks to complete it. You'll hopefully find the form to be quite straightforward, with questions that are short and to the point, and lots of guidance alongside each question. So we'd encourage you to take a look once it becomes available, as some of the guidance within the form in particular hopefully will help you think through your answers. We are also, as soon as we can, aiming to share a document which outlines the headline questions on the form, and we're aiming to get that out by the end of next week, again to help you to start think through your responses. But we would also, as I say, really encourage you to flick onto the form itself when it becomes available, because there'll be some additional guidance on there. I just also wanted to clarify that we're expecting decisions to be made and communicated by the end of July, not June, as indicated on an earlier slide. We're working on plans to take a participatory grant-making approach, which will hopefully involve some of the decisions being taken by a panel with local representatives on, including research professionals and members of the community. In terms of the budget, So the application form will ask for a budget to be submitted and for you to indicate whether you're applying for an early stage or more developed idea. I just wanted to clarify really that although we're talking about early stage ideas of up to £25,000 or developed ideas of around 90,000, you can apply for amounts in between and around these figures. So don't feel like it needs to be one or the other in terms of the budget size. If you think you need something in the middle, around 40, 50, 60,000, you will be able to submit an application on that basis too. We've said around 90,000 is a ballpark figure for the larger grants. The maximum you would be able to apply for would be 120,000, but we do expect grants of this size to be quite rare. And as we say, 90,000 is the sort of ballpark average that we're anticipating. There isn't a lower limit as such for the grant size, but bear in mind that we expect early stage ideas to be around 6 to 9 months in length. And so the budget should reflect this rather than focusing on kind of one-off activities, as we talked about in other workshops. So do think about your costs and make sure you've factored everything in as best you can. There will be some guidance as to what can and can't be included. And there is also some information on this on our FAQs on the website already, which might be helpful. If you're thinking of applying, but you're not sure about how much to ask for, please let us know. Also, if you're wanting to apply as a very informal group, but you maybe don't have your own bank account or feel like you have the processes to feel confident to manage the money, please don't be put off. We'll be working to find a host who can manage money on your behalf if you're in that position. So do have a conversation with us and we can discuss that with you. I also just wanted to clarify that we won't be using any rigid benchmarks in terms of value for money. So although the application form will ask how many people you would like to work with in your project, there isn't a target figure of the number of people who will benefit for every £10,000 you apply for or anything like that. Of course, the panel will sense check your idea and raise queries if numbers look really high or really low, but there won't be a formal framework that this is assessed or compared against. There are lots of different approaches you might want to take with your project, which could mean either really deep engagement with a smaller number of people or broader work with a wider community. And we're open to supporting projects across a range of these approaches. I think there probably are still some questions about when and how you might be able to be linked up with a researcher in your area. And when the development coordinators join us later on today, they'll give us an update on their local plans for that. And so the last thing really for me to say is just a reminder really at this point that the whole approach to this application journey has been a new way of working that we wanted to test out. We're really open to receiving feedback at any point, so please do share your thoughts, good and bad, with us. We will look to do a more in-depth look back at whether the application process has been successful after the deadline on the 14th of May. So if you do receive an email or invitation to get involved in that, please do take us up on it because we'd love to hear about what has worked and what could be improved. So I hope that's a helpful run through for now. I'll hand back to Lewis, but as we said, please do put some queries, thoughts in the chat and the Q&A box as needed.
So today, as we said before, we're going to be building on previous discussions on how to build a partnership between communities and researchers to explore research in different community contexts. And one of the things we want to raise is the idea of using arts and creativity as potentially one way that we can bridge this gap between research and different community experiences to better understand each other, which is, of course, one of the key aims of the fund. So I've invited our two guests, Chava Erlanger, who's a community artist, and Kat Cresswell, who works for Vocal in Manchester, to talk a bit more about their project, Still Life, which explores the sensitive topic of stillbirth in the Jewish community through the arts alongside researchers and midwives. Before we start, it's important we do mention that this was a project that was led by researchers, including Dr. Michelle Desforges at the Maternal Fetal Health and Research Centre at the University of Manchester. So it wouldn't have necessarily been eligible for the fund in this case. However, there is a lot of learning, and I've had a pleasure of chatting to Chava and Kat about their project in terms of how this could be, give some ideas about how local creative practitioners can be a way of exploring and adding context to existing research led by the communities, and developing new researchers resources that explain this research as well, and hopefully lots of practical advice. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. To start off with, perhaps would you mind introducing yourselves and telling us a bit more about what the project was? Kat?
Sure. Hi, Lewis. Thanks for having us. So my name's Kat. I work for an organisation called Vocal, based in Manchester, and my whole remit is around engaging members of the public in health research. So I've been working with the Maternal and Fetal Health Research Centre, which is a research centre based at one of the hospitals in Manchester, and they specialise in doing research on the placenta, but also they do a lot of work around stillbirth, understanding that and how to prevent it. And we wanted to reach out and do some work with a community that we were seeing, or the midwives that they were seeing a lot in the clinics around pregnancy problems, but they weren't engaging with research, and that was the Jewish community. Manchester's got one of the largest Jewish populations outside of London, and we know as well there's lots of cultural stigma and taboos around talking about stillbirth. So it just seemed like a really sort of the timely kind of community to work with. So we knew that work using kind of creative methods was really important for talking about such a sensitive topic. And so for us, we set about looking for an artist that we could work with to design a series of workshops to engage with women. And that's how we met Chava.
Chava, do you mind introducing yourself as well?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Chava Erlanger. I'm a community artist based in Manchester, and I got involved with the projects just through an advertising on the Art Council. And my practice generally is research through art. So we set out to design 6 blocks of 6 workshops to help the researchers engage with the community, and the community with the researchers. We had a lot of initially we had a lot of difficulties around recruitment, and we did have to become open-minded and change the way we were recruiting. That included contacting people in the community, like rabbis, religious leaders, midwives, etc. We also had the issue around privacy and government contacts. There's historical suspicion in the Jewish community for that's a long different discussion around engaging with government bodies, and we had to sort of reassure people and be aware of that to allow people to get involved within the project. We also had to be aware of, although I'm Jewish myself, I'm modern Orthodox, and there's very different groups within the Jewish community, the ultra-Orthodox, the unaffiliated. And I had myself even to be sensitive to all the differences to allow people to be part of the project.
Oh no, and I think that's a theme that's been picked up in previous conversations as well, in terms of that importance that, not treating groups as a homogenous group. And of course, with this process, we're hoping to hear directly from communities who will, know a lot of this. Could you tell us a little bit more, Chava, about perhaps potentially what came out of it in terms of the creative process? What did the arts bring in from your perspective?
Okay, so we created. Well, the final outcome was the idea to have 30 pieces of art, but actually we were counting, we have hundreds of them. But the idea is to have a final body of work, an exhibition, whether it's be digital or a physical exhibition, containing 30 pieces of work representing the outcome of the workshop, so that the participant we're not taking from them information. People also have something to take home with them, because when people are sharing, they're giving us their story, they have something to take home with them. So we are going to produce a booklet, whether it's digital or a physical, that they can take with and have something out of it. Another thing that came out through the artistic project is, one, it wasn't the idea or the outcome we expected, but the community found it very therapeutic. So that was a side bonus outcome. So that was us giving back to the community and the participant. And the other thing is a guideline for stillbirth, for a religious guideline for the hospital staff for after someone suffers loss, which is, again, a project which wasn't funded, but we saw the necessity of it. And we facilitated it with it, or the hospital facilitated it. And I think one of the important things is to be very open-minded and be flexible about, again, sticking to your outcomes, because you have a guideline what you want to get out of the project. But if you can, something like that, the guideline, which is so important, be more flexible and be open-minded of how you're going to navigate things within the project without sort of, we wanted to support, the participant wanted to open a support group. We had to be very strict and say, well, that's not going to work. Another very important thing is when you're trying to work with ethnic minorities is there's a rule, the minority knows more about the majority than the majority about the minority. Saying that, and again, I always say knowledge is power. You don't have to be Jewish or Christian or Muslim to work within a community, but you have to learn and understand the community and be part of the community, a part of them, to be able to facilitate a good project. Another thing which I found very useful as a leading artist is being part of the research team, meaning I've actually literally interviewed the researchers, the doctors, the midwives, to understand where they're coming from, what they want to get out of the project, so that I can be part of them. So I have to leave myself as an artist and what I want from the project aside and become part of the team. So teamwork is crucial. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many points in there, Chava, and what I'm really hearing, and especially is maybe some of the challenges of that, having such a prescribed project that had, certain restrictions. And I guess with the Ideas Fund, we are trying to do it almost the other way around. And it's that kind of like what happens when you emerge from communities themselves, and obviously, be able to navigate some of those issues. And so many things are unexpected. And how do you navigate those and make sure they're supported as well? Because sometimes that's the richest part. And hopefully, if you're a community member listening, getting a sense of, how working with maybe local community artists could be one approach of how you can process, existing research and make that accessible and find that meaningful. And also, as you say, have developed different tools and guidelines and more information and enriching information for the researchers as well. So again, it's that two-way element. You've kind of linked into that kind of my next question around that importance of cultural awareness. I suppose you've kind of mentioned a lot about being prepared and like doing your research and knowledge is power. What were if you think about at the beginning of that partnership, and that's probably where a lot of our listeners are, certainly for the Ideas Fund, what are the kind of very practical things that you had to consider when you were starting to build this partnership? What kind of advice might you give for others to think about that? We'll start with Chava, actually.
So I think, thank you. I think the main thing is being open-minded and really listening to the community. So listen to what the community wants. Don't come from, it's not us up there, especially with research, doctors are put on pedestal, researchers make it as an integrated project, listen to what they want. We had a very a strict rule that in the workshops, researchers and doctors all have to come to, we had regular attendees, and they all had to take part of the workshop. So it's not the community and the government body or whatever body comes from the outside. Again, we had to be very strict about boundaries. So, for example, I'm part of the Jewish community. I had to be very strict about privacy, phone calls, all those type of things, what I can give them and what they can expect for myself as well. And I think being very realistic about what you can achieve. Another important, I think, when you're applying for funds, people look at numbers. You think about quantities. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. And, having 6-7 solid participants is much more useful than, ticking a box of 30 participants and not reaching what you want. Another practical thing, what we have done also during the sessions, which was crucial, is recording all the sessions before when we were doing the face-to-face ones. And then obviously listening between the words. So there's loads of information to pick up. And I think Kath can go over to that and say the research have picked up so much from that. That's sort of practical tips.
Thanks, Chava. There's so much in there, and even the level of data protection and privacy. There's a lot of practical things to kind of get right. Coming to you, Kat, what about from your perspective in terms of setting these partnerships up?
Yeah, so I guess for us, we knew that we didn't have all the expertise in the team, obviously. So I'm somebody who works in public engagement. With in the centre there are researchers. We've got research midwives and specialist midwives. We've kind of got that side, but we knew that we didn't have that knowledge about the Jewish community, or how necessary to use the kind of creative skills in the best way, which is why we brought in Chava. We also worked with a Jewish community maternity liaison representative as well, who obviously had links with the community, but also had that expertise. So for me, it was really understanding who you need in that team. And I know this project is kind of more community led, and I know it can be difficult sometimes to think, oh, where does the research come in? And actually, it's a great place to think, well, what could they bring to this project? What sort of their expertise, and how could they come in and having those conversations? But and then the other thing, just the really practical things. So just setting up partnership agreements. So just starting straight from the off, kind of understanding what are your aims and objectives, what are the expectations of the different parties. So Chava was really clear, kind of, what we wanted her to be involved in, and she's gone above and beyond. It's amazing, but she knew what she had, she knew what the budget was, and also kind of just discussing things like who's holding the kind of intellectual property and things like that at the end, because obviously we're creating pieces, so they're just really important things to consider.
Can I add something, Lewis? I think,
please do, yeah,
because I think it's really important. When you're running projects, so for example, I have very good creative skills, but I'm really bad in paperwork and all of that. You need someone like Kath, which is, again, unbelievable, someone which has, and when you're applying for a grant, make sure you budget in things like a coordinator, someone that will do your paperwork. And again, don't be scared to ask for the right amount of money, because one of the biggest mistakes, and I've done it in the past, is asking under budgeting your project, and then it just fizzles out and doesn't finish out. So, and look out for government guidelines, charity guidelines, but definitely a large project anyhow needs somebody like Kath behind you, because it's about teamwork and knowing your limitations, really.
And that builds on really nicely of what we're trying to say about the fund, in terms of please do budget for what you need and build in that type of support. And we definitely especially we're trying to work and support communities who may not have applied or managed external funding beforehand, so we want to make sure that the support is in there, so that to budget in for management or finance or training, so that there's long-term capacity building. So if that isn't, we don't want to set communities up to fail in any way. And I think what you've just said kind of really reiterates that, I think. And also even talking about things like you say, like intellectual property, and I guess when communities are thinking, who are listening, thinking about working with researchers, who owns the outputs, who own, even, I know this isn't to support research, but how is that attributed and valued in different ways, and who gets to claim that? I guess maybe just to round up a little bit, thinking about, well, what were the kind of impacts in terms of the projects? And it'll be good to kind of go to Kat in terms of that first, and then maybe finish with Chava.
Sure. So, the impacts are really wide-reaching, but there's sort of different levels of them. So I guess from a participant point of view, and I saw there was a comment in the chat about this, the women who took part, I'd say, the ones that we've kind of followed up and had chats with and wanted to speak more, have just been so positive about the experience of being able to come together, share their experiences, but also be in a room with a researcher and with a specialist midwife, and being able to ask those questions about whether it was their experience, but also be able to kind of build their understanding of research and what's going on in Manchester especially, and what can they get involved with. So there was massive learning there from the researcher's point of view. The researchers who came along just have the most, so much more understanding now of the lived experiences, not only of the Jewish community, but also of just women who are going through this. Sometimes researchers can get really detached from the thing that they're researching, and actually it's a brilliant way to bring people in and really give them that understanding. And then I guess just finally to say that actually I think everyone who came along took something from it, because actually we all experience grief, whether it's whether it's around, a baby or not. And, we were all talking at a very human level, and it took away sort of research being something that's really abstract and done by a group of people, the university. And it made it something that was really human, and that it kind of joined us all, and we could have really, really honest conversations. And, we just heard a lot more about what the women would like to see happen in research in the future. So we learned loads.
Thanks so much, Kat. And Chava, just to finish, any last thoughts?
So I think some of the positive outcome, again, which we can do during the project, but came out afterwards. So one is the guidelines for the hospital, which is the feedback of back from families and mothers is just overwhelming. And the other one is support groups, which the women have decided to set up themselves outside the project. People that have reached out for therapy for the first time, again, not an outcome we expected. And I think the main thing is I do feel we've broken a certain barrier between and suspicion between the hospital and the Jewish community, which is something we really picked up on. And I think that's if people are willing to get help, and it's betters their life in the future for future pregnancies in this case. What more do we want?
Well, thank you both so much. I think, on the themes, everything from, making sure that we research and pay artists properly and the different rates, all the way to, thinking about, how to make plans, but also be open to what might be unexpected. And hopefully, again, people listening can get a sense of how a community leading this type of project, even if, for example, we're not supporting therapy or therapeutic interventions, these types of relationships that can be built can certainly be a gateway to those types of projects and later on down the line, and supporting better understanding and research and outcomes. So I want to say a massive thank you to both of you. If you've got anyone listening who's got any questions, I think there's a few that's popped up. We'll hopefully be able to bring you back at the very end of the session. We'll certainly be sharing a bit more about the project on the summary sheets, including some other visuals from the exhibition as well, and how you can get in contact with Chava and Kat and find out more. So thank you, both of you. And we're going to turn to my next hat, I think, my development coordinator hat. We're going to bring all the other development coordinators back now, who we introduced at the very first webinar, and also Gill to introduce us and interview us to share our own updates from the different areas.
Thanks very much, Lewis. Hello, I'm Gill. I'm the grants manager at the British Science Association, and I'm joined by our fabulous development coordinators from our 4 target areas. So really, this is going to be kind of a bit of a Q&A between me and them. And I'm going to start off really asking, what are the experiences and reflections that you've had so far through the last few weeks of the fund? If I could come to Harriet and Gill in Hull first.
Hey everyone. So my reflections are firstly that there have just been so many phenomenal ideas, but then also that some are still more organisation led and could be more embedded in the community. So we're just sort of saying to people, focus on who your community are and what they need at the moment.
Hi, I'm Gill Hughes. I work at the University of Hull and I'm working with Harriet and Kate. I think it's been so brilliant that with the amount of people that have shown interest in the fund, because it is doing something different. I think we're finding that the researcher part is a bit of a mystery to people. So we are getting some ideas for collaborations between people. And so what we're here for really is to demystify that process for you so that we can help you to think about how a researcher might be part of an idea.
Thanks, Gill. And Paolo, our development coordinator for Oldham.
Thank you, Gill. Kind of echoing what Harriet and Gill kind of have just said, I'm really seeing a lot of ideas that, although are really brilliant, are framed around the community need from the perspective of the organizations or groups' work experience. And although we are completely understand that the problem might be known to you, the question that I'd like you to ask yourself whenever you think about the idea is, how do I know that this way of doing this particular project and solving that problem is what the community and the people that are affected by that problem want, right? So ask that question of, how do I know that this is the right way of tackling that problem, and how can you involve them in the decision-making of that process? And I'm finding that sometimes that's the kind of the weaker aspect that I'd like to kind of tackle a bit more, and that's why you'll hear a lot of questions in meeting with me around that.
Thanks, Paolo. And Roisin and Erin from Derry and Strabane in the northwest of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so I think from my reflections are we have some fantastic ideas coming through. There are a lot of ideas currently that are supporting young people. And I suppose it's remembering that they're not all going to get funded. So we were really pleased from our last workshop that some groups are able to collaborate with others. It also feels like groups who haven't worked with a researcher before, that this is a great opportunity to partner with a researcher and build a connection that can last beyond the funding.
Yeah, I obviously agree with all that Roisin said. We've been seeing some really exciting ideas coming through. Lots of great sort of not yet tried approaches, which I think is great. And I think where we've seen ideas coming through that have been kind of working best is where those projects fit most closely with some of the unique opportunities that the Ideas Fund is presenting. And I think kind of just re-emphasising those key messages about what the Ideas Fund is specifically for is really important. So messages around the nature of the partnership with the researcher, which is obviously the focus of today, echoing some of what's been said before about how embedded it is in the community. And something that's come up for us quite frequently as well is that this isn't intended to fund the continuation of existing activities. So I think we just keep re-emphasising some of those fundamentals really about what the Ideas Fund is particularly for.
Lovely, thank you all. Some really interesting reflections there, particularly around kind of how do we know this is important to the community in the way that they want things to be responded to, but also that kind of newness of that relationship between community and researcher, which I think brings me to my next question, which is really, what does a good partnership look like to you? And if I come to Paolo first.
Thank you. I think this kind of brings up and it kind of touches on what Chava said, talking about earlier. And I think it's about really be clear around the expectations that you have of each other. Who is going to do what, when? And as part of this discussion, it's really important that you explore your values as a group and as a partnership. What are the values that really connect you at a deeper level and a personal level, and that really will bring your project forward and will push your project forward. And I think it's important that sometimes we don't really talk about insecurities about projects and that we are setting up together. And I think this is something that's really important to start tackling, because you then be able to answer, how can I then solve these insecurities, solve the challenges using the skills that I have in this partnership. So yeah, that would be my really good answer. Yeah, my answer.
Thanks, Paolo. Lewis, I've realised that I forgot to come to you before. So you do want to tell me kind of your major reflections so far, and then a little bit about what you think good partnership looks like. Sorry, I forgot you.
No, it's all right. Don't worry. I'm sure people have heard enough of me, but I guess in terms of reflections, I think it's all the similar things. This is hopefully feels like a slightly different way of doing this type of project, and I think, and this type of funding, and that is difficult. I think we're all learning together, and I think this is an opportunity for us to do something and put money where our mouths is, and not support necessarily business as usual. So all those themes that we've just picked up in terms of questions like, well, what does a community mean, and what does community led mean, and what's the kind of spectrum of that? And I think for us that's the main kind of, how do we bring both community members who've so many great ideas that are developing across the Highlands and Islands, how do we build that collaboratively, and how to have those conversations and bring researchers in those conversations as well to understand the dynamics that we're looking for, and making sure that that's kind of centered. Certainly in terms of partnerships, I think a lot of it is, it sounds obvious, but structuring in things like clear touch points, like having conversations. And I know that sounds like very basic, but ultimately I also aware that it's a difficult time for the sector. And I think very often when time is busy, then sometimes those check-ins can be the first things to go. So it's about having those, when you're building a partnerships, what does that look like, to make sure that you've got that time built in as much as you can, and contingency as well. Like these are emerging relationships. There's only so much of a relationship you can build within the next 6 weeks, even before the grant goes in. So being realistic about that and being open to what might happen, but also structured enough so we know that there is a meaningful sense, and things will happen, things will change, things will go wrong, personnel might change, or different circumstances might happen. So again, it's about having those really frank conversations to kind of talk through some of those key things. And then the last point is language. We all use language in different ways. And I think within academic versus community settings, public engagement or impact, these things can mean completely different things or nothing at all. And so just clarifying your terms together in those types of conversations, ideally over a cup of tea, but that might be a bit harder over online.
Good advice there, Lewis. And what about you, Harriet? What would be a good partnership for you?
Well, definitely building on both of those first answers. For me, it's that curiosity to learn from each other, and that bridge that's going to be created between the researcher and the community. That seems really exciting, but also I think it's when your relationship's connected and you're honest and you have good communication and there's plenty of equity there, and it's about both of the two sides. I think what's really important when you have a partnership is to build that time in to plan the work together. And we're aware that there's only 6 or so weeks until the application goes in, but you could build some of that time into your actual project time as well, to deepen those connections.
Thanks, Harriet. Roisin, shall I come to you next?
Sure. I agree with a lot of what's been said from Harriet and Lewis, and I think being honest and open is really important, and setting clear expectations is really important as well. And raising issues early if there are any. And I think, as well as Lewis was saying, those check-ins. Sometimes we can get really busy and we forget to have the check-ins, and they're really important as well, going forward with a partnership. So I think that's all I would have to say on it, really.
Erin, would you have anything to add?
Some of this may already have been covered, but I think it's with entering into kind of any working partnership, really, and especially if it's a new kind of relationship and you haven't worked with a particular party before, it can just be useful to do some really basic groundwork about what are the values and what are the ways of working, that you each want to commit to, and the values that you want to see coming across in the partnership and in the project, and in that just sort of get to know you phase, really building that recognition of what the different parties are bringing, what the strengths and the assets are of each party, and then I guess sort of everyone understanding why working in partnership will make the project stronger than any one party doing it alone. Because what we don't ever want is for people to think the partnership working is tokenism or not. I think it's important that everyone understands and recognizes kind of the true value of what the partnership will bring, which is more than just the single party delivering on its own.
Thanks, everyone. Some really important points there about relationship building, about finding individual roles that's kind of more than the sum of its parts, I guess, working together. And a little bit about kind of contingency and allowing for it to develop, which brings me a little bit to the plans that people are going to be putting together at the moment. So what would your key tips be for communities, community groups, and kind of how they're listening for things today to build into the planning that they're doing right now? So if I come to Erin, back to you first.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I suppose it's just about, for me, really, at this stage, revisiting the fundamentals of the project and the fit with the aims of the Ideas Fund. And I think if you can get that right and you're really clear on those things, then hopefully the application process will be so much easier.
And what about you, Harriet, on your tips for people's planning at the moment?
It's never too late to keep learning from the community. So keep having those conversations and helping them to explore the resources and assets that they have and identifying those gaps. And also keep reflecting on conversations that the community have had in the past as well, because there might be some really key nuggets of information in there.
Brilliant. And Gill, what about you?
Most of the things have been said really, but I think it's about respecting each other as both parties in the sort of idea development, building trust in the relationship, putting in time to collaborate, because I think that's really important, because a lot of people won't know each other, so it is going to be quite a tough ask in a short time. But also that we're here to support that process as well. So, if people are feeling unsure about things, do contact us, because that's part of what we're here for.
Yeah, really good point. Lewis, would you have anything else that you wanted to suggest to people?
I think a lot of it is just about how we value everyone's time, and very practically, as someone who finds the administration or the finance aspects can be quite intimidating, and I think that's okay to be intimidated, especially. But please do, ask for the support and build in that support where you can. So do talk about things like we mentioned in terms of who should be paid and what is a fair rate, copyright and attribution, remuneration, obviously access needs. It's not always about money. It's so it is, but it is thinking about how do we make sure that everyone is valued, and thinking of things like safeguarding and managing risks as well, just like you would for lots of other different types of projects. And it can feel a little bit different because we are asking people to potentially do something a bit new with researchers. There might be slightly different expectations, so it's just about navigating that together and making sure you have build it in, and where possible, if we can build in funding within the grant to actually support you to develop that long-term capacity, or bring in staff members locally, then that is impacts out with the grant itself, which I think is only a good thing.
Thanks, Lewis. And then finally, Paolo, anything that hasn't been said already?
I think it's really important that you really start thinking about challenges at these stages, and you start kind of looking a bit forward, because this is the time to start addressing how you might deal with those challenges and those issues. Is there any time that you need to embed within the project timeline to allow for possible issues to be resolved? Does that mean that maybe you have to increase some of the budget to allow for, especially resolving those issues involve people's time? So it's really, I think it's important to now take a step back, or starting to take a step back around what are the possible challenges, how can I solve these? So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And then finally, from each of our areas, what's next? What's next that's kind of happening that people should know about or should get involved in? Harriet, if I come to you for Hull first.
So this is the exciting, nerve-wracking part, I guess, because we've got the thematic workshops that we're going to start building on. We want to pull people together who have got similar ideas and could potentially collaborate. And then we're matching researchers, which, if anyone's had a call with me this week, I've said it's a bit like a jigsaw. We're trying to stick people together in the right way and make it work.
Thanks, Harriet. That sounds hard work, but ultimately fabulously rewarding when we get the final picture. Paolo, if I come to you for Oldham next.
Very similar to Harriet, there's going to be some practical things. Tomorrow I'll be emailing out everyone that kind of came to the regional webinars with some information and a survey to really start understanding a bit more of the thematics, but also the areas of research that we need to look into within your individual project. I will be setting up also a collaboration hub, which will allow you to start seeing who's interested in those in similar areas and potentially collaborate together. And then we have a workshop next week where we kind of start to really hone into the themes and talk a bit more about collaboration with each other.
Thanks, Paolo. And then Roisin or Erin, I don't know who wants to answer about North West Northern Ireland.
I think we are sending out our survey. We did a Survey Monkey survey for everyone to complete before the last local workshop. So we're going to send that out again, because that helps us to sort of theme and the ideas that are coming up. So we're going to send the Survey Monkey out so people could fill that in. That would be great help for us. And it would also helps us then with our breakout rooms at our next local workshop on the 25th. We will be trying again to theme them. so that there'll be opportunities for people to collaborate. And then I suppose having those conversations then from that about the researcher and how to connect them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roisin. And Lewis, the Highlands and Islands, what's next?
So very similarly, we've sent out an Eventbrite. So we've got themed smaller conversations so we can pick up with individuals. And I appreciate everyone's patience with us as we're getting through the emails. We do also have a public forum using Trello, which you can sign up for and start sharing ideas and potentially building collaborations. And we are also mapping researchers as well. And there's a survey that we'll be sending out very shortly to kind of start that mapping and that matching. But thanks again for everyone who's interacted with us.
That's brilliant. Thank you all so much for your thoughts and your reflections. As we've been going through these webinars, obviously we've been recording them, but we've also been putting together kind of summary and reflection sheets with questions for all of our potential applicants to help think through their idea. And we'll do exactly the same for this session. And hopefully in total, it's going to give you kind of a really good basis for thinking through what you might want to put in your application form. So we'll be sending that out early next week after this webinar. So I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's been, I think, under an avalanche of your brilliant questions to see which ones he thinks we need to pick up on. Thank you all again, development coordinators, for all your input.
Thank you, Gill, and thanks to everyone for all the questions that have come through. There's been so many. We were trying to respond as we came along, but I think probably the best thing to do is we will, rather than rush answers now, for a lot of the ones that are remaining, we'll try and cover some of the highest voted ones, and then beyond that we'll circulate. We'll take some time to write out our responses and circulate those so that we can do it in a considered way and make sure we cover everybody, rather than trying to rush through. I definitely cannot multitask, is what I've just learned over the last half an hour. So but one of the main questions, and some of the questions that have come up, it kind of covers a few areas, is again about the role of the researcher within the project. And this is something we covered in a bit more depth last week, but 2 weeks ago. But because it's come up again, I thought I might just quickly kind of revisit that. So as you've heard, we've had so many ideas and examples and thoughts about the sorts of projects that people want to do, and given the breadth of ideas and suggestions we've had, it's probably easier to just talk through first what isn't eligible for the role of the researcher, and then give some more examples of what could be possible. So as I said, we covered this a couple of weeks ago, but I want to make sure that people who are on the call today have had this answered if we can. So one of the main elements of the fund is around how relationships are being built between communities and researchers, and we'll be looking to support ideas where skills can be built in both directions. So for example, it could be a community learning research skills whilst the researcher is gaining knowledge from the communities that can help inform their wider work, just as an example. So the project is unlikely to be funded if you're looking to just bring a researcher in to deliver a one-off workshop that's quite transactional, or feels like you're bringing in a service without that opportunity for longer-term building of a relationship. We're looking to support that balanced and two-way, and so your project's unlikely to be funded if it's driven by one side or other, for example, with the researcher being the lead. And building on that point, although it's about bringing researchers and communities together, the fund isn't about purely funding research projects. So your project is unlikely to be funded if it's about a researcher coming in and doing research with no two-way interaction or opportunities for the community to gain skills and knowledge, and or where the communities themselves are purely research participants. This isn't a research fund. It's about exploring the benefits of when communities and researchers work together. And then the final point on what isn't eligible is that the funding isn't available to just bring somebody in to evaluate your project and measure your impact. On its own, it's unlikely to bring opportunities for longer term relationships. Yeah, that's the key area that we want to focus on throughout. So when you are thinking about your ideas, what you might apply for, just bear those things in mind: opportunities to work together, and build relationships, and for skills to be built in both directions. And the projects that are likely to be strongest, or most likely to be funded, will be the ones where that's kind of really clear as to what the plans are in those regards. In terms of what the role could be, and again, I hope this is helpful to revisit, but as we've said, it's hard to be too definitive when you've had 200-300 people join some of these webinars over recent weeks. But for example, it could be about working with a researcher to learn more about or build upon existing research in your area of work or field, and testing or applying some of the learning from that research in your practice or approach. Could be about helping to translate complex research findings into something that's more meaningful for the people that you work with. And we've heard about this. It was on the first webinar from Alma from Planet DVOC 91, the project that we talked about there. Ideas around working with researchers to develop resources for others could also be eligible. So members of a boxing gym working with sports scientists to develop podcasts, Facebook posts, etc., to share evidence and learning about training in a healthy way. And another example might be that you want to work with a researcher to help you or the people you work with to learn more about research skills, knowledge, and methods to take into your work. So again, hopefully, as you can see with those possible examples, and it's hard to be prescriptive because of the number of ideas and thoughts that we've had, but they would all sort of demonstrate some of those key areas that we've talked about in terms of building relationships between the researchers and the communities, and the sort of skills knowledge in either direction. So I hope that covers some of the main points. As I say, there's a few questions on there which have come through, which are great around the role of the researcher. So hopefully that's useful. As I say, we will try to respond and put some of that again in writing for people to and we'll circulate that once we've finished, probably next week. Another question, which is sort of quite high up the list, is around whether the Ideas Fund will be open again in future years. No definite plans for that, I suppose. This is a pilot fund, so we're delivering the fund as the British Science Association on behalf of the Wellcome Trust, and they're really interested, and we're really interested in testing out both this application process, as we've talked about, but also whether this leads to projects that are strong in terms of some of the areas that I've just talked about. So it's a pilot. We'll be looking at the sort of results of this and see what sorts of projects get funded, and then potentially, hopefully, we'd love to keep going with the Ideas Fund and roll it out further, but there are no definite plans for that at the moment. And maybe just one other important point is just there was a question about whether the fund can fund a project officer to run the project. Yes, salary costs are eligible, salaries and overhead costs are eligible for this fund. Some of the information you'll find on the FAQs of the website talks through, lists out what is eligible and ineligible, and there'll be more guidance on that to come through with the application form itself. So I hope that's helpful. I realize we're never going to be able to get through all of the questions, but we will try to, as I say, pick them up and circulate next week. So just a reminder of the next steps then. So this is our last central webinar, and the recorded version of this will be available on our website, theideasfund.org, early next week. We'll send out the Q&A, as we've said. We're now going to just put on screen the details again of the next local workshops. There they are, and the details of the development coordinators and the British Science Association team are on there. Thank you once again, everyone, for your time. In particular, on behalf of the BSA, I'd just like to single out Lewis before he comes back on, and his contribution to this series of events. It takes a huge amount of work behind the scenes, and we're really grateful for the efforts that has been put into what we think. We've had loads of great feedback that people have found this really useful. So thank you, Lewis, and thank you to our captioners, tech support and BSL interpreters, as well as our speakers, of course. And if you'd like to just one final time, everyone can turn their cameras on, and we'll have a farewell wave and hope to see you at the local workshops next week. Thank you, everyone. Take care.